And I think when you question a kid about this, you have to ask it once and then give the kid time to think about it. And then bring it up casually again a couple days later. Hey, you remember that thing we talked about the other day? I was thinking about it some more. Do you have, is there anything else you want to talk to me about with that? And do that a few times, especially if you suspect anything, for sure. But even if you don't, bring it up once, bring it up again a couple days later, bring it up again a couple days later. Give their little brains time to process and then make sure to tell them that if anything happened, even if they're not telling me anything did, they're not going to be in trouble if they feel like they want to tell me something. Now, some kids are just vocal and will talk fine, but other kids won't. And that's the kind of kid that you have to eke it out of.
And if you think about this, you could actually develop a pattern with your kids where they're not talking about molestation, but if when they tell you something, you punish them because they told you the truth, because they took a cookie, dropped the cookie jar, spilled milk, and they could have kept it a secret, but they told you, and now you punish them. You're doing the same thing. You're setting them up to keep secrets and keep things inside.
I always tell my kids that they'll get in more trouble for telling me a lie than for whatever they did in the first place.
My kids absolutely know that, and that's the same with never mind kids. When I was in the teams, that's the standard. You tell me what happened. Mm-hmm. Don't lie to me what happened. If you tell me something, you did something wrong, there was an incident, something bad happened, we'll handle it. But one thing we can't do is if we try and cover something up and we get caught, now there's going to be hell to pay. So, that's
another thing that I do with my kids is there's some great books out there about talking to your kids about abuse and stuff. And there's one that I read to them sometimes, and it's not, those books aren't meant to just read once and never pick up again. They're a perfect opportunity to bring it up casually in conversation. There's a book, it's called I Said No, and it's written by Zach and Kimberly King. And Zach is a little boy, and his mom, Kimberly King, and they wrote this book together. And it's really great. It talks about people as being like red flag people, and those people can be the sort of people who just give you a strange feeling. They unsettle you. They make you feel a little bit odd, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they've done anything wrong to you, but you should be able to pick out those red flag people and then talk to an adult about what is making them uncomfortable.
Now is that because this red flag person did something that gave them a red flag? Because one of the things that I told my kids, especially now that my daughters are older, one of my daughters was going on a trip somewhere, and I was giving her the talk, listen, you need to watch out. And my daughter said something to me like, Dad, I'm not going to be, going and hanging around with some weirdo. Mm-hmm. And I stopped her right in her tracks. Mm-hmm. And I said, it's not the weirdo, the guy that looks weird. It's not the guy that looks like a predator that you need to watch out for. The guy that you need to watch out for is the guy that seems like a nice guy, the guy that just, helped you with your luggage, is the guy. Not all of them, but you need to watch out for that. I mean, if you look at some of those serial killers, I think it was Ted Bundy, but he had the whole thing where he had his arm in a cast. And he would ask someone to help him. He would ask a woman to help. Hey, I need to get my groceries in the car or whatever. And they'd see this kind of, and if you ever saw a picture of him, he looks like a nerd. And he has his arm in a cast, and he's got a collared shirt on. He looks like a white collar guy, and he's got a car. And next thing you know, as soon as they help with the groceries, boom, the arm's out of the cast, and he's abducting them. And so how do they identify like the red flag people?
It's more about your gut intuition. If there's something that just makes you feel a little bit weird if they say something. It's about listening to that internal voice that might be telling you something's a little weird, but he's a really nice guy, he's and learning how to identify that and listen to it. Because that's, like I said, pedophiles, sexual predators, they're not stupid people. Most of them aren't stupid people. They're very calculating, and they look for the right opportunities. So you've got to teach your kid specifically that.
Yeah, and it seems like you need to teach your kids specifically the I said no part, right? Because even you as a kid, you don't know how to say no. Mm-hmm. You don't know how to scream. You don't know how to tell someone to stop. And also how to identify what, kids don't know where the line is. If you don't teach them what's right and what's wrong in terms of physical contact with them, then how are they going to know? How are they going to know?
Exactly.
That's a good point. Now you don't want to scold the kid for making a mistake, and how you hold lying in higher regard as far as violations go, where if this environment is kind of created that what you say doesn't mean that much, so be careful with what you say, But if the environment is, hey, you can come to me with anything, and you demonstrate that, don't just say like once a month, say, hey, you can come to me with anything. Next day they come to you with something, you're like, hey, I'm busy, or hey, grown-ups are talking, Yeah. So if you actually provide that environment consistently, they'll come to you with anything that's off. They'll be like, hey, Mom, what's this? Hey, there's a rabbit in the backyard, So even something that small. Yeah. So some weirdo or some red flag person comes and they're doing something strange out of the ordinary, they're going to come to you way more likely,
Yeah, we talk about inoculation when it comes to training for combat, and, you inoculate yourself to stress. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I talk about, like with self-defense especially for women, is if you train jiu-jitsu, you get inoculated to the fact that someone's going to be grabbing you, touching you, grinding on you, and so you're over that. But it seems like this is the same situation you do with kids, where you inoculate them to the uncomfortable conversations. So they're okay talking about stuff that, let's face it, your kid is not going to be comfortable talking about some things unless you inoculate them and you get them used to it and they understand what's right and what's wrong.
I think it's correct on what you said. It's the parents are typically the ones going to be more uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Like you'd be surprised what kids will just talk about. Yeah. Like weird stuff. Unless you made it uncomfortable for them, they'll talk about some weird stuff, especially 5, 6. But if the parents, hey, in your scenario where they'll ask you something, you give them an answer, they say, good, that's the answer I want. Let's don't talk anymore, because they're uncomfortable.
And it's on the parent to initiate these conversations. Yeah. It's not on the little kids to come to you and tell you something big has happened. It's on you as a parent to initiate these conversations. Yeah. My daughter is, she's shy, and she doesn't express her emotions very well. She's not the kind of kid who comes and just tells you stuff. And I don't want this to sound like I'm beating this stuff into my kids' heads every day and terrorizing them with the thought of scary things that might happen to them, because I'm not. I talk about it casually enough, I think, that it gets through to them. But she's in kindergarten, and she had a little issue, and she told me that a boy has been coming up to her on the playground, and I always use correct terminology, because that's another thing I feel like kids should be comfortable talking about their bodies. Mm-hmm. And she told me, and it was hard for her to tell me. She didn't want to tell me, and I could totally see it because of her personality. She came up and she told me that a little boy was coming up every day on the playground and like poking her in the vagina and then asking her to do the same to him. And I think she's 5. She told me that, and I was like, okay, what I'm doing is working, because knowing her personality, she didn't want to tell me that, but she did. And so that was also the perfect experience to sort of teach, like, okay, cool, not a big deal. He's 5 years old. They little kids do that and they don't know what they're doing, but let's go talk to your teacher and make sure, and I immediately took action and showed her that I wasn't going to let anything happen to her if she was uncomfortable with it, without blowing it out of proportion.
I was going to say, because a lot of times what kids are embarrassed about from age whatever
is you making
until
a scene.
is they don't want to tell you because Dad, my 17-year-old will do that, as will my 7-year-old. Dad, So I think that's another thing, is how do you make sure that they realize that you're going to be, without blowing it out of proportion, which I agree with you. It's a 5-year-old kid, it's a 5-year-old boy.
Yeah.
They're doing, like you said, they're talking about stupid stuff that they don't understand, and they're doing things that they don't understand yet. That's like, okay, but let's now teach them. Let's let them learn at that
and
age.
that gave me a lot of confidence that if something, because she dealt with that in a great way, if something bigger were to happen, I now feel like she would be much more inclined to come to me. Mm-hmm. But what you're saying about not wanting to make a scene, I think as I got older and understood what was happening to me a lot more than I did when I was little, I didn't want to make a scene. This is somebody who was my parents' best friend, was deeply involved in our life, had been with us forever. And imagine what telling would look like. And that wasn't something that I was prepared to handle. Even when I was a teenager and I knew exactly what was going on and I knew exactly how wrong it was, the scene that would ensue if I said something was not something that I was willing to deal with.
That's even hard for adults to do. Mm-hmm. Any kind of like confrontation that's going to cause these big ripples, it's like, man, I got to weigh all this out now. Like, can I strengthen myself up versus, create this big scene? I'd rather deal with strengthening myself up and dealing with it.
Especially because
almost.
You have no idea. In your mind, you probably made it even a bigger, crazy scene. You were probably thinking that they were going to have to make a choice between you and this guy, Maybe in your mind, that's their best friend, Now you got to convince people, and it just becomes easier to just not say anything.
You don't know if they're going to believe you. You don't know if he's going to go to jail. You just don't know what the consequences are going to be. And it's much easier to just be like, all right, I've dealt with this. I can keep dealing with this. I'm not going to cause any ripples.